Africa Climate Resilient Investment Facility, AFRIRES, strengthening capacity of member states and stakeholders to build climate-resilient investments in transport, energy, agriculture, water, and ecosystem sector.
Okay, so since arrival in IDEP for my research fellowship, I have conducted research. I kick-started my research work. My research work has been on climate change, coastal erosion, and implications on environmental migration in West and East Africa. In West Africa, we selected Senegal, and in East Africa, Kenya and Tanzania, we are choosing because of the peculiarity of those two countries. Those two countries has a large coastal landmass, and also over the years has witnessed adverse impacts of coastal erosion. The Mombasa area of Kenya comes to mind when it comes to coastal erosion. It's a region that has over the years been experiencing negative impacts of coastal erosion. And so the research was to look at the comparative analysis of what is happening in West Africa and also in East Africa, and to draw lessons and as well as make policy recommendations that will be able to stem the tides of coastal erosion. The research reveals increasing rates of climate change, especially precipitation, rainfall, and also temperature. And the increase for Senegal, the increase in rainfall trend portends huge flood risks, which calls for concerted action to be taken to avert flood disaster. And so in terms of coastal erosion, the research also revealed some important landmarks such as continual changes of the shoreline. The research reveals that the shoreline continues to shift significantly, encroaching on the adjacent landmass, and this portends huge risks. The urban infrastructure, the result also shows increasing urbanization. In other words, increasing changes of the land use from predominantly agricultural or other land use to urbanization. So as the urban development cannot increase along the shoreline, it comes with huge risks. In other words, as the shoreline continues to increase at the current rate, at the current trajectory, it will continue to expose those urban structures to risks. And so the research was able to recommend that, look, there should be a policy that will regulate the development of urban structures along the coastline. We also did scenario modeling. With scenario modeling, in other words, the research tried to examine, should the shoreline changes at different rates, what will be the consequences. And we used 10, 20, and 30 meters. Currently, the shoreline and the sea level rise is put at 4 meters. So at 10 meters, a whole lot of communities and regions in Senegal, we are all vulnerable. So in all, the research show high vulnerability of the coastline along Senegal and Kenya and Tanzania to huge risks. And of course, this also in agreement with the IPCC, the latest assessment report, in which sea level rise was put at was one of the critical issues. In other words, the report pointed out that sea level rise, that African coastal regions are vulnerable to sea level rise, and that the sea continues to rise at this current rate. It means that a whole lot of land mass will be lost, a whole lot of resources will be submerged. And so my research was corroborated that IPCC latest assessment report. And so the research shows that at different scenario modeling, both at 10, 20, and 30, that wetland, there will be huge wetland loss, there will be huge population displacement. And that takes us to the environmental migration aspect, because the research was to look at coastal implications as having the potency to trigger human displacement. As the shoreline continue to change, continue to shift, and as it continues to encroach on adjacent landmass, there will be loss of livelihoods, and so people will, there is a tendency, natural tendency for people to migrate, a concept which we refer to as climate-induced migration or climate migration. And so if the report points out that in the foreseeable future that there will be huge human displacements in Senegal, Kenya, and Tanzania. And so this is one research that policy makers need to take very serious. And so we made a lot of recommendations. The research has been presented before the IDEP management, and soon the report will be presented before the ECA, the larger audience of the Economic Commission for Africa, which is based in Addis Ababa. Okay, so basically that is what we are doing. And of course, we know that the environmental migration is a very serious issue for communities and for regions whose major sources of livelihood are fishing, whose major sources of livelihood are dependent on the coastal resources. The changes in the shoreline, the encroachment of the shoreline, and sea level rise poses grave danger. In other words, these resources which the population depend on will be severely affected. So there are a whole lot of implications on poverty, on economic aspect, and all that. So the research was able to make the research was a further contribution to knowledge on the issue of climate change, coastal erosion, and environmental migration. The research has been on since January. On arrival, I quickly set the stage for the commencement of my research work. In January, when I arrived for the commencement of my fellowship, and I just presented the research. The first phase of the preliminary results was presented in September, and I'm hoping that before the end of this month or early November, the final version of the research will be presented to the ECA, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, who is funding the fellowship program. The fellowship was mentored or supervised by one of the senior staff of IDEP, an experienced researcher in IDEP was assigned to supervise the work. And so I have gained a whole lot of mentorship from her. Not only that, I've also received a lot of input from the management of IDEP and other senior colleagues. Basically, most of them were climate scientists. Like there have been input from the African Center for Climate Change, the African ACPC. They have made a whole lot of input, and I believe that during the final presentation of the research, more inputs will be made, which will be factored into the research, and that will call for some of those inputs will be taken into consideration in the preparation of the final draft. In Senegal, the research reveals that the shoreline there have been high incidence of coastal erosion. The incidence of coastal erosion was more. The duration of the study was from 1986 to 2022, and so that was about 34 years. And so the research was able to state clearly the rate of erosion over the years. And the research revealed that more erosion rates was experienced during the 1986 to 2016. 86 to 2000, the research was broken into intervals from 86 to 2010, 2010 to 2016, and 2016 to 2022. So more of the erosion rates was experienced between 2000 to 2016. And accumulatively from 1986 to we have recorded over 95% erosion rates, over 90, while in Tanzania and Senegal, Kenya is 78%, and in Tanzania 75% erosion rate. Now we also notice some increasing rate of accretion. Accretion is build up, and so there have been commensurate build up. In other words, coastal erosion appears to be slowing down because of some measures that has been put in place. But that does not dismiss the fact that it remains a very critical environmental problem. Yes, the result look at the contributory factors. The result look at the contributory factors, and we look at shoreline changes. Shoreline change, in other words, areas which were wetland areas has now been taken over by urbanization. There will be massive deforestation, you know, and of course we know the importance of the forest resources and the land use and the trees and all that, because they are able to absorb some of the groundwater. So when we continue to clear this in the shoreline have an easy way to continue to move unabated. So land use is also a factor, urbanization is a factor, massive deforestation remains a factor, and of course erosion basically is a combination of physical and marine forces, marine factors. So we have a lot of coastal processes, marine processes and wave processes that are responsible for this, and of course not only now sea level rise and high tide and current. These are some of the marine meteorological factors that are responsible for that. In terms of temperature, the research investigated the trend of temperature from 1986, and the results confirm previous researches that have been conducted, especially with the latest IPCC report on increasing trend of temperature. In other words, the 3 countries that were selected for the study will continue to experience hotter seasons in the years to come, going by the study result. So if that result is taken into consideration, then we can begin to experience increasing rates of temperature. Now, I mean, the 3 regions will continue to experience more hotter days, more hotter temperature. Of course, since I arrived in Senegal, I've experienced some of the impacts of climate change. The 9 temperatures has increased, and if that trend continues, then it's going to be very uninhabitable. It's going to affect human comfort, and so the country needs to begin to plan adaptation measures in order to mitigate this impact. Even the coastal areas, which is climatologically supposed to be much cooler, and we are supposed to be a bit comfortable, temperatures around the coastal region is also increasing. So no part of, and of course this potent huge region will be high incidence of drought, you know. So the temperature which was at 1986, temperatures in the coastal regions was around 26 degrees, now is around 35 degrees. So that reveals huge increase over the years. We also examine some of the causative factors, some of the human factors that propels people. And of course, in migration, we have what we call the push and the pull factors. So what are those pull factors? What are those things that are pulling people? And one of those things that are pull, of course, Dakar in Senegal, Dakar remains the pulling point that is attracting people, you know, while at the centers of origin, we have the origin and destination in migration. So this origin remains the source regions, the local community where people become uncomfortable with the environmental processes, and so that naturally compels people to move. The loss of livelihoods as a result of erosion, the loss of settlements as the sea level rise and coastal erosion continue to ravage on people, continue to encroach on livelihood and on buildings and structures. So that naturally will also push people, force people to move. That's what we call forced migration. Now we also look at other dimensions of migration. We look at the gender perspective, and my research reveals that women are also involved in migration. Traditionally, we might see migration as a masculine or a male affair, but one key aspect of the research is that women are also involved in migration, and this potent also has huge implications. When women migrate, there are other social vices that are likely to emanate from that migration. You know, it could result to forced marriage, it could result to abuses on women, and all that. Then we also look at the exposure rate, and we discover those who are living around the coastal erosion are more at risk. They are more exposed. So we look at the exposure level, and we discover that people are living in coastal region have a higher exposure rate. So we also look at the coping strategies of migrants when they move to a new area. We interview some migrants, some people who we identify that have traveled, migrated from one of the coastal erosion sites, which has been recognized by the United Nations as a heritage site. And we were able, as first when he settled here in Dakar for the first time, he gave us his own perspective. Then we also look at other coping strategies, how when he arrived here, some of the things he did to easily adjust to life.
AfriRest facility is a joint initiative of the UN Economic Commission for Africa, Africa Union Commission, the World Bank, and the African Development Bank, with initial funding from the Nordic Development Fund. The training, in conjunction with the African Institute for Economic Development and Planning, IDEP, aims at strengthening the continent's decision-makers' capacity to plan, design, and implement climate-resilient projects. IDEP is the UN Economic Commission for Africa's training arm based in Dakar, Senegal.